Thank you for joining us for this session on climate resilience. My name is Alonso Sanchez, and I'm an international student from Costa Rica, studying economics and international relations with minors in history and finance, and I'm part of the symposium's organizing team. On campus, I'm involved with the Tufts Economic Society and its research initiative, and I serve as a research trip coordinator for the Latin American committee. My interest in economic development has led me to pursue community-centered perspectives through an internship with the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact in Thailand, and I also worked with the Agency for Local Development in Costa Rica. I also worked as an advisor intern in the Costa Rican Congress, supporting legislative research and committees such as the public finance and public security and drug trafficking, and also municipal affairs. An experience that strengthened my understanding of the world and how policy is negotiated and implemented.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Boren. I'm a sophomore at Tufts University as well, majoring in international relations with a minor in French and peace and justice studies. And I'm also part of the symposium's organizing team. On campus, I participate in an English as a second language program for Tufts studying staff. I serve as the External Relations Chair of the Women in International Relations Club, and I'm also a member of the Tisch College Student Advisory Council. I also had the opportunity to work with an NGO in Thailand called Minott Garden, where I supported outreach for sustainable and reusable Tupperware, an experience that strengthened my interest for environmental sustainability and social impact. I'm also deeply passionate about refugee and immigrants' rights. So off campus, I volunteer with an organization called an organization dedicated to empowering and supporting vulnerable Latino immigrant communities. This year's symposium is organized by the Institute for Global Leadership at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life as part of the 40th anniversary celebration. Today's conversation rests on a simple yet urgent topic. Climate shocks are no longer rare. They are compounding stresses that expose how fragile our systems are. While we are sitting here today, drought and flood cycles are not only destroying crops, they are increasing food insecurity and pushing already vulnerable households deeper into debt and displacement. While we are sitting here today, disasters are forcing people from their homes at a record pace, with 45.8 million internally displaced triggers in 2024 alone. And while we are sitting here today, climate change is no longer a future threat to biodiversity, rather has already driven extinction by human-induced climate change. This panel is about resilience as more than bouncing back. It's about whether societies can anticipate evolving risks, coordinate under pressure, and reduce vulnerability without deepening inequality and instability. In a world where disaster can develop into economic disruption, displacement, and social conflict, climate resilience becomes a test of governance, public trust, and our ability to act collectively before the next crisis arrives.
Once again, thank you for joining us, and also thank you to our panelists for being here. We have asked them to begin with a 6-minute introduction. Essentially like an oral op-ed with some insights into their work, and later we will have the discussion questions and eventually Q&A session. So I would like to begin with Ms. Bethany. She's a PhD candidate in international relations at the Fletcher School, focusing on climate adaptation and disaster prepared policies, with a particular emphasis on identifying gaps and challenges in the policy landscape.
Okay, so I'll start us off by giving you stand up here. Hi everyone, thank you all for being here. I can't help it. Is this on? Does this sound like? Press the. Hello. All right now. Okay, great. So, as Alonso mentioned, I am a PhD candidate in my final months of my PhD here at the Fletcher School, and my work focuses on climate adaptation policy, looking at how communities are responding to disasters and preparing for future climate shifts. And because this panel and symposium more broadly talks about climate risk and resilience, I wanted to start by grounding us in what we mean by the term resilience. So resilience is often thought of as the ability of a system or community to bounce back after a climate shock. And so when we talk about resilience, I want to also think about the idea of what we want to bounce back to. So thinking about if we're returning to systems that are already inequitable or that are already vulnerable, then resilience can simply reproduce harm and bring us back to a state where a community is already struggling. And so I want to often, in my work, think about resilience not just as recovery from a disaster, but also about building systems that are more equitable before disasters and more protective during them. Because often what we see in my work in studying post-disaster communities is that the people who are already the most vulnerable in society before a disaster occurs are the ones who are most impacted by disasters. So thinking about the unhoused, older adults, people with disabilities, low-income households, and communities with low English proficiencies, we need to, when designing policies, think about how our responses are reaching these communities and how the policy design can incorporate the considerations and specific needs of these communities in the policies themselves. So in some of the communities that I've studied here in the US, some examples that we've seen are that not all warning systems get sent out in the languages of all the community members, and so people are missing the emergency communications that are being sent out at very urgent times prior to a disaster. So thinking about what we can plan ahead for and be more proactive in our policy making. Often what we see, and one thing that I saw in my research, I studied Butte County, California, which is the community that experienced the Camp Fire in 2018, which at the time was the most damaging wildfire to ever hit the US. And one thing that we saw in the lead up to the fire, the community had just a few climate adaptation and wildfire focused policies at the county level. And then in the year after, we saw a major jump. So 2019, suddenly there was more than double the amount of policies. And this is something really common that we see across disasters, is once a major disaster happens, communities start really realizing that they need to start developing policies and clarifying their plans. And so one thing that really motivates my work is working with communities to think through, before a disaster happens, what types of climate hazards they need to prepare for. So I work with a lot of climate scientists who do climate risk modeling to think about what types of unprecedented extremes are communities going to experience in the near and long-term future. So often we have a tendency as humans to plan for what we know. So thinking about the climate hazards that we've experienced before, so maybe here in New England, we're pretty well prepared for snow. And so we have good snow management in general compared to other places that might be less experienced with snow. But as the climate changes, more and more communities will be experiencing hazards that they've never experienced before. So we call these unprecedented extremes, or shocks that have a high potential for surprise. And these events tend to be particularly damaging, both in terms of cost and also in loss of life, because communities aren't able to plan in advance if it's something that they haven't experienced before, or at least it can be more challenging to do that. And so working with the climate scientists that I work with, what we try to do is do scenario exercises and share the data on changing climate risk in these specific locations so that communities can then incorporate this into their policy making. Because throughout my research, one of the biggest challenges and gaps that I've seen in this space is the idea that we are experiencing a rapidly evolving climate, but most of our policies are very static. So even in places that have hazard-focused policies, so for example in the US we have a lot of flood-focused policies at the federal level. It's our most commonly addressed hazard within existing legislation. And that's great, but often the policies that we have don't have specific language or parameters around updating the policies based on future and evolving climate risk. So when thinking about policy reform and policy gaps, it's really important to incorporate this changing risk into our policy making strategies. So again, moving to that idea of this more proactive adaptation. And then I think also we have a big implementation challenge, and what we see here in the US and also in other parts of the world is that adaptation and climate resilience requires a lot of forward thinking and planning far into the future, and this often doesn't align with political cycles, or if climate change, like here in the US, is a politically polarizing topic. What we've seen at the federal level in my own dissertation research is this idea that climate policies are developed and revoked between administrations, and especially for climate resilience planning, this makes it really, really challenging to have the sort of long-term, future-looking policy that we need in order to adapt to climate change. So this prevents implementation over time. So what we've seen is in one administration, they'll develop a really large climate bill or an executive order that mandates agency-level climate adaptation, but then when this is revoked, it leads to kind of this stop-start of climate adaptation action and really limits what we're able to do. So I think trying to move past this political polarization, particularly when it comes to climate adaptation and resilience, because it's something that affects communities across the political spectrum, and I think people around the country and around the world have a lot of motivation in their own communities for why they want to be prepared for disasters and for changing climate risks. And we're seeing that at the congressional level as well, a larger willingness of Congress on both sides of the aisle to pass climate resilience policies. So I think going back to the guiding question of how do we build resilience that is effective, equitable, and durable, I think the main important factors are centering the needs of the most vulnerable in the design of policies, planning for future risk, and also invest in more durable policy frameworks, institutions, and implementation so that these efforts actually endure and aren't just sort of patchwork policies that are then planned and revoked over time. I'm happy to answer more questions throughout the panel, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hayden. Now moving on to Professor Minott. She's a professor at Northeastern University, holding an interest in international environmental policy and its impact on marginalized communities. She holds a PhD from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where she explored the impact of environmental disasters on civil conflict.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the accommodation, as I was not able to drive to be there today. So today I wanted to touch a little bit on my experience, my teaching, and my research as it relates to, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, at the volume.
Do you guys have volume? Do you want it down or up?
My volume is at maximum.
I think here.
Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so my research and my research comes from an experiential space, and what does that mean? It means that my background and my interest in environment stems from my background as a person who is from a small island developing country, Jamaica. I am a first-generation immigrant to the U.S., and upon graduation from college, I joined the Peace Corps, and I was in Paraguay, South America, for 3 years. And from that experience, my original focus was to go into development and development economics, but my on-the-ground experience in witnessing the impacts of climate change and its impacts on small farmers and their livelihoods really shifted my intellectual and my research focus towards how the environment impacts all elements of the human experience. And during my time at Fletcher, my areas of specialization was international environmental policy, security studies, and conflict resolution. And from that experience, I really started to observe the impacts of resilience, environmental resilience, climate resilience, disaster and post-disaster resilience. And with that in mind, I did my research on the impact of natural disasters on civil conflict. So that took me to Aceh, Indonesia, which was where the 2004 tsunami hit landfall and killed almost 200,000 people in a matter of minutes. And during that time, there was a civil conflict going on in the region. So it was under military control, and it was very active in terms of skirmishes and conflicts. My second case study was on Sri Lanka, which dealt with the tsunami's impact on the civil war going on there at the time. So based on that, I had the opportunity to go to Aceh, Indonesia, and explore the impacts of the tsunami on the conflict, as well as the impact of the disaster on the conflict in Sri Lanka. And so there began really my serendipitous relationship, if you will, with Indonesia. So I've gone back to Indonesia several times. I actually was there last summer, in which I created a dialogue through Northeastern University on how resilience impacts small island nations, small island states. And based on that research, I've been able to really delve deeply into how communities respond to resilience, how communities either fail or are strengthened by community efforts, and not just community efforts, but also cultural and governmental impacts on how communities adapt and deal with resilience. So we all know, and as the previous speaker so eloquently stated, is that climate change is not something that's coming. And climate change is here. And even in the United States, a wealthy developed nation, we are seeing the impacts of climate change. We're seeing fires, we're seeing droughts, we're seeing severe snowstorms, et cetera, et cetera. And we as a nation are struggling with that, the ability to adapt and to be resilient. So with that in mind, consider what small island nations are going through and what small island states are dealing with. You know, we're dealing with stronger storms, cyclones, extensive droughts in communities that rely more heavily on the land than, say, in the United States. We see higher average temperatures. What does that mean in terms of tropical spaces and where it's already hot? How does that impact the communities and the livelihoods of people there? And more poignantly, we see sea level rise, which is one of the big concerns of small island developing states. Indonesia, they're moving their capital, Jakarta, because it is sinking because of sea level rise. It is sinking faster than any other city in the world, up to 25 centimeters a year. And in addition to that, you're also seeing northern Java, where seawater and sea level rise is seeping into the wells and farmlands, and shoreline loss and floods, storms, droughts, landslides, all of that has become really harder to predict. And that's compounded by food insecurity, shifting rainfall patterns, and the compounding inequality. So the hardest hit regions tend to depend more directly with natural resources. And so that brings into mind, into focus, my other area of expertise, which is vulnerability, and how vulnerable populations deal with this. In Indonesia, women were hit harder by the tsunami because of gender cultural implications. The fact that many women were covered because of their faith, and many women didn't know how to swim, and many women their first impulse was to try and save their children. And many women were at home and in the house when the tsunami hit. And we see that pattern expanded to other areas of climate resiliency. So I think my focus is generally trying to figure out solutions and figure out how to improve upon and diminish the levels of injustice and improve the levels of resiliency for these communities who don't have the resources to really work and overcome many of these disasters, while at the same time taking into consideration what their adaptive capacity and what the cultural context is, and getting their opinions and experience based on that and their backgrounds.
Thank you so much, Professor Minott. Now, last but not least, we will be moving on to Professor Creuheras. He is currently Democracy Visiting Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, Aceh Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. He's an expert in public policy and sustainable development who worked throughout his career to advance democratic governance through institutional building, civic participation, and strategic policy making. Professor Creuheras.
All right, can you hear me? Is it on? Yeah? All right, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and an honor, because I know that this is the 40th version of this symposium, and 40 years. It's 4 decades. It's time, right? For those of us who are slightly older than you, being here on the 40th version of this international symposium at this great institution, Tufts University. It's a great honor, and it really humbles me to be here. My perspective, my approach, based on what my predecessors have just shared, Professor Tijen, Professor Minott, it's pretty similar. I just want to add one more element to the equation later on the conversation. We started talking about climate resilience as the ability of a system, such as a community, as a city, as an ecosystem, business or country, to prepare, withstand, adapt to, and recover from climate-related impacts like extreme heat, floods, droughts, wildfires, and storms. We've heard this so many times, but I guess it's important to mention that in order to make sure that we are all on the same channel, and the idea of thinking about the components of climate resilience in a very similar way. And from my perspective, and from many other authors' perspectives, climate resilience has mainly 4 elements related to preparation, for example, that have to do with the risk assessments that Professor Minott was kindly sharing with us, the early warning systems that Professor Tijen was sharing, the climate-informed planning, then absorption that has to do with the infrastructure design to withstand many of these issues, the buildings, the drought-resistant crops. Then one of the most important ones, which is the one I guess we or many of us focus on, which is the adaptation one. And I'm glad to hear that Bethany has been spending the last 4 years working on that, and we have an amazing expert on the table on these issues in terms of changing farming practices, in terms of updating building codes, in terms of expanding green spaces to reduce urban heat, and then the last element, which is recovery. How can we recover from whenever we have a crisis, we have a disaster, when we have an emergency, and how we can respond to any of these things, when cities installing drainage systems, when farmers are switching from climate resilient crop varieties, when a coastal town building is working on restoring mangroves, companies diversifying supply chains to reduce disruption from extreme weather. So these are some of the things that we have to focus on, and this matters because when we think about these things, one of the most important things that we have to keep in mind is that we have to protect lives. Right? That's one of the most important risks that we have to keep in mind. We have to reduce the economic losses, we have to safeguard the infrastructure, we have to support the long-term sustainability. And in simple terms, I guess that climate resilience has to do with being ready for shocks and adapting to the harms that they can cause and how we can reduce those harms that can be experienced over time. So with those ideas in mind and having heard about some of the importance of vulnerability that Professor Minott has already shared, you know, and being thoughtful about who are those who tend to suffer the most when we have these inequalities, right? We need to think about the people themselves again. What is it that they are experiencing? Who are the ones who are left out? Who are the ones who really need to worry about these ideas and how we can solve these problems? And as I was sharing earlier, the third element that I would like to put on the table and bring on the equation, as many of you might know, I spent most of my professional life working on the energy sector and trying to bring in energy as one of the elements for reducing climate resilience, climate crisis, and thinking about ways in which these can be transforming for the lives of the people in the most vulnerable areas, in the areas where people are the most vulnerable. And the part of the energy sector that I want to focus on, which is the part that almost no one talks about because it's very abstract, is the energy efficiency part, right? If we were in this room yesterday night, right, and we were having a talk like the one we're having now, we were having a panel, right? And as soon as we left yesterday night, around 6 p.m., right, we went to a cocktail, a dinner or something, and then the workers came in and changed the lighting throughout the night, right? And we came back this morning to have another panel, right? We would look at the room and it would look like the same. It would be exactly like the way it looks like, right? We wouldn't really see what had happened. But maybe the lighting system we had in this room would have been 10 years old. Maybe the air conditioning system would have been like 15 years old. And that doesn't mean that it's not okay, right? But it works perfectly. It gets maintenance every month, especially during the winter. They clean the filters and everything, right? But the energy use for the air conditioning system, the lighting system that we might be using, if we actually thought about the one we had yesterday night and the one that we have this morning, it's completely different. It seems to be the same, but it's completely different. One of them was using probably 80–90% more energy than the one we are using today, and that can be like life-changing in many ways. So again, I want to bring the energy efficiency element to the equation because whenever we have extreme heat, we have higher cooling demands, we have grid stress and blackouts, we have cold snaps, and that also tends to create heating demand spikes, fuel shortages, and during floods and storms, there's infrastructure damage and service disruption. So bringing energy efficiency to the equation gives us the opportunity to reduce peak loads, to lower energy costs, increases in building survivability during outages, and makes backup systems like batteries or generators last longer. So bringing efficiency to the equation, it's an opportunity of reducing risk, and it can be a risk reduction strategy and not just a climate mitigation tool as part of adaptation. So I guess that's one of the things that I wanted to start with. I think I've taken more than 6 minutes so far. Am I okay? And we can continue on the conversation in a few minutes in regards to bringing this idea to the discussion. But I guess that these challenges bring us an opportunity to change the perspective in one of the specific ways. I'm not saying it's the only one. There are many other ones that we can focus on, but they can be like life-changing in many ways. And based on my personal and professional experience, when I had the opportunity to jump into the energy efficiency arena, and I was able to think about this and innovate with programs, and I can give you some examples like this. For example, within the public sector, right, or even in academic institutions, and in places where vulnerabilities are higher, as it was stated earlier. For example, let's think about the hospital. Let's think about a school in which they don't have efficient energy systems. They don't have insulation. They don't have the adequate air conditioning systems. They don't have the proper lighting systems. They're probably using more than 80% of their bills paying for energy, right? They're using all of the financial resources for paying for energy. Whereas if they reduced this energy consumption, they could possibly use that money for having access to better equipment, having access to even like in the poorest areas, having access to keeping the children in libraries, keeping the children in their classrooms for longer periods of time, where they can study, where they can have access to better conditions, rather than having to go home earlier because their energy consumption bill only allows them to be at school for 3 or 4 hours. Even the fridges, like at some point in time, and this is probably something that may be like a joke for many of you, but you will be moving to an apartment once you graduate from the university. You will be going to an apartment, and maybe your mom or dad or your grandma says, take my fridge. This fridge is 20 years old, and you can take it, so you can start. They're giving you a gift which is going to cost you a lot of money, because that fridge is going to be using a lot of energy, even though it seems to be like it's really well kept, and you will be spending a lot of your money on electricity because of that fridge. It's going to be much better for you to go and get a new one that is energy efficient, that only uses like 1/10 or even 1/20 of the energy of that fridge, even if it's really good. So I'll continue the conversation in regards to that. I know it sounds a little bit disruptive, because in these climate resilience talks, you're usually talking about the forests and other things, right? But I always like to bring this element to the table, which is very abstract, and at least in my professional life, in my perspective, it gave me the opportunity to innovate and develop projects that were very interesting, and we can talk a little more about that. Thank you again for the opportunity of allowing me to share some ideas with you this morning.
And please join us for a round of applause for Professor Minott as well. Okay, so to get the conversation started a little and set some foundational bases, we would like to ask you all to begin with what climate resilience means specifically in your work, and briefly address what are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about it in general. So whoever would like to begin, please go ahead.
Okay, I will start. I think that one of the most important misconceptions that we all have is that climate is not existent. I mean, it seems to be that in many discussion arenas, the impact of climate is not existent. There are a lot of studies in the world. Some of them are very supportive. Some of them say that it does have an impact, and things are being impacted every year based on climate change and global warming and so on. Some other studies defend the idea that it doesn't matter, it's not existent. Some of us believe it does have an impact, and that's again why we think that adaptation and planning it's really important, because we have seen many things happening in different parts of the world, and many others don't agree with it. You will have both perspectives in academia, in the professional world, in the private sector, in the non-profit sectors, defending either or the other one. So I guess that's a way to start the conversation in regards to that.
Thank you. I can also just quickly jump in on a misconception. Is my mic on? Thank you. Yes, so I think one of the misconceptions that I see in my work, and I think it's also valuable thinking about what Professor Creuheras just said in his remarks about, I think what we see a lot in working in resilience and adaptation is that mitigation, climate mitigation, so decarbonization, and adaptation are often seen as sort of opposing ideas, that you either have to focus on one or the other, and that it's, historically, people working in climate have sometimes seen climate resilience work as, oh, we need to focus exclusively on mitigation, because if we just focus on adaptation, then that means we're giving up. We're sort of admitting defeat. We're admitting that we just have to adapt and figure out how to operate as the climate changes. And I think I think it's harmful to see it as just a trade-off. I think we can see the co-benefits. So in thinking about this idea of energy efficiency also as a resilience strategy, I think that's a great example of a way that we can think about adaptation and mitigation together, and seeing them as strategies that can often go hand in hand. When we talk about climate finance, that's a whole other can of worms, but often these things are seen as sort of in competition with each other for a limited amount of funding. But I think when we think about how to sort of tie them together, but also admit that we do need dedicated funding for climate resilience and adaptation, because we already are on track for certain levels of warming. So we can't exclusively focus on climate mitigation, but we need to be focusing on both of them simultaneously.
Thank you. And Professor Minott, if you would like to say anything. Oh, I think you're muted still. Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, I think you're muted once again.
Oh.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We can hear you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the challenges we face with climate resiliency and resiliency in general is that it's perceived as a one-off. You know, once the immediate problem is addressed and the immediate issue is addressed, it's a done deal. And it's hard, especially within a political context, to understand that resilience is temporal. It's geographical, it's, you know, physical, it's economic, it's social, and it's environmental. All of them are woven together. And so when you look at it like that, it's not just something that can be addressed in a short time frame. Resiliency is something that has to develop and adapt and evolve over time. So, you know, if we look at changes over time, approximately 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live within the context of climate vulnerability and the vulnerability of ecosystems and people to climate change is driven predominantly by unsustainable development patterns, you know, and so we've seen how that has evolved and how that works with regards to adaptation and in regards to financing. So when we look at climate change and resiliency, you've got to look across geographical and across cultural boundaries, and you've got to look at how to address these issues, not just as a one-off, but as something that evolves over time, and it's constantly needing to be addressed and adapted, particularly in vulnerable communities.
Thank you so much for your answers to all the panelists. And in addition to general questions, we would also like to ask personally targeted questions based on each of your work, but at any time feel free to jump in if you feel you have any addition that you can.
Yeah, I would like to start with Professor Creuheras. What would you say is the #1 barrier to implementing resilience at scale?
Okay, I think that there are two barriers, not just one, that are really back to back. The first one, I guess, very well relates to either accepting or not accepting that climate is important, and the second one, which is real, even though we as humans can do our part at home and everything, is the financial element. So in many of the projects that I have had the opportunity to work on, right, I try to make sure we kind of follow three objectives. The first one is the assessment of the situation, because we need to know whether the situation is being impacted through a climate crisis, through even in something which is business as usual, that seems to be okay, but it's having a long-term impact, which not assessing that risk can be impactful. The second one is developing a financial mechanism. We need to work on a financial mechanism that makes it feasible to whenever you want to have an intervention to make it happen. Otherwise, it will not happen ever, right? And that's usually where most of the people stay, right? They do these two things, they work on the assessment, and they get the financial mechanism. But there's one which is, I guess, the most important, which is the behavioral change one, in which we need to understand that we have to do things differently. If we don't change our mindset, if we don't do things differently, we are going to be going back to the same thing. and we have to look at things in a very dynamic way. Usually we assess things in a static way, not understanding that everything is dynamic, everything is changing, everything is moving, and we need to look at it in that way. And if you allow me, I want to mention something, since we are in an academic institution, which is a framework that I guess it's important for all of us to keep in mind. Professor Mark Moore, one of the institutional pillars of the Kennedy School at Harvard, came up with a framework, which is the Creating Public Value framework. Many of you might have studied his framework at some point, and he started with the idea of making sure that we all need to think about the strategic part of whatever policy or intervention we have to work on, and obviously making sure that it has like clear objectives, it has clear goals, we have processes, we have metrics, we make sure that we have all these that we are taught in the classrooms, right? But sometimes we forget that if we think about that as if it was a triangle, right? And we have this strategy in the top, there are two other things in the triangle that we have not been like really considering. And these other two parts of the triangle, on one side, include the regulations. What regulations are there that allow you to move forward, right? In terms of changing this resilience, in terms of having adaptation, mitigation, and even recovery tools. Do you have the regulation that is necessary for making this happen, for making this change of behavior happen? In that same side, you also have to consider the political part, right? It might be really interesting to have that regulation, but if you don't have the political part aligned, there will not be resources for that, or things are going to be stagnated, and things may not be moving forward. And in the other part of the triangle, you have to consider the resources that you need, right? If you want to build a nuclear plant, for example, right? In terms of bringing clean energy to a specific area, you need the human resources, the people who have been studying and have been prepared for building that plant. If you don't think about the infrastructure, if you don't have the infrastructure to do it, then it's not happening. If you don't have the IT resources, it's not happening. So it is not just about the strategy and the idea and a very well-developed idea that can stay in a cabinet forever. So that's what Professor Moore came up with a few years ago, and that's what many of the students, not just at the School of Government at Harvard, were studying. That is something that in most of the schools where policy was being taught and implemented were thinking about. But I guess that in this part of the 21st century, we have to come up with the dynamic perspective of this. We need to think about it is not just creating public value. And that's one of the ideas that I have been working on for the past few years as an academic, as a professional, and as a working professional, is the idea of creating sustainable public value. Because again, if we don't think about the idea of making sure that things are dynamic and that things are moving and changing all the time, right? We will have this very wise and interesting framework looking at it from a static perspective. But if we think about it from a sustainability perspective, with the idea of creating sustainable public value, we need to make sure we think about the economic aspects of this, we need to make sure we think about the social aspects of this, and we need to make sure that we think about the financial aspects of this, right? So this changes the whole thing, and that gives us the opportunity. We think about that triangle as a dynamic triangle in which it is not just the idea of creating public value, but creating sustainable public value surrounded by all these things that are transforming and moving as we live our lives. Then it's going to be different. And since I'm taking a lot of the time with the microphone, I don't want to miss the opportunity to just for 1 minute, if you allow me, to mention something that Bethany has just shared in regards to co-benefits. Right? I think it's very important, if you allow me to just go back for 1 minute to the conversation in regards to energy efficiency. When I was telling you about the different ideas of transforming the lighting systems, of changing the air conditioning systems, and so on, there are different aspects. And remember, one of the things we need to keep in mind is that we are human, right? We need to go back to the idea that sometimes we forget, even with the internet, the artificial intelligence, that we are human. We do care about safety. We do care about health. We do care about education, right? And as humans, we need to make sure that we always have that in mind. Bringing energy efficiency to the equation, for example, gives us the opportunity to think about these co-benefits that Bethany was talking about, and how they can have an impact on our safety, on our people's safety. For example, if we have access to less expensive energy, for example, we can have public lighting that allow us to have our streets very well lighted, right? And people can walk and be safe, and we can reduce the number of assaults, we can reduce the number of rapings, we can reduce many of these things that could be happening in areas where we don't have access to safe lighting. If we think about this in terms of education, again, if we have efficient schools, we can have access to the classrooms for longer periods of time. We can have classes in the mornings, we can have classes in the afternoons. If we have efficient energy systems, air conditioning systems, we can use them also early in the morning when it's very warm in those areas in which sometimes they cannot be in the classrooms because the heat makes it impossible for the kids to be there and use the classrooms in better ways. And again, for health, if we do this and think about this in hospitals, these co-benefits of having access to energy efficient systems can change the whole perspective and the equation of having access to good equipment in health, and having more surgeries done, and having more primary care that can access by the population, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry I'm taking a lot of time. The old guy usually takes time more than anyone, sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much for your answer, Professor Creuheras. This question we would like to direct to Professor Minott. Within your work in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, when have you seen climate shocks becoming a stability and a security issue?
Well, I think that the literature, yes, I'm not muted, okay. I think that one of the things that's really significant about climate shocks is that it's not necessarily the creator or a start of conflict per se. It's what's viewed as an accelerant to already underlying and existing tensions. So I see that all throughout my research and all throughout my observations, particularly in the case of my research for my dissertation. So I do see conflict and security being inextricably linked to climate and resource allocation and resource inequality. I mean, there was a famous article that came out in Foreign Affairs about the link of climate change to the Arab Spring. And it provided many interesting contexts into how the drought in the Ukraine, in Russia, in China, which impacted the sale of wheat and flour, which was a main staple in that region, and led to the increases in prices and inflation that sparked the conflict and the toppling of several regimes in that region. Particularly if we're looking at my specific case studies of Sri Lanka and Aceh, the conflict in Aceh definitely was impacted by the tsunami, even though many of the talking points and international media stated that that wasn't the case. When I actually was on the ground interviewing former insurgents and conflict victims and victims of the tsunami, one of the things that I found that I was not anticipating is the fact that the disaster actually impacted the opposing, the insurgents, in terms of it was such a shock to them, and being in an area where it was highly religious under Sharia law, it was viewed as a historical, or not a historical, but a religious sign. And it changed the mindset and changed the impact and the will of many of the people to continue the conflict. Because prior to the tsunami, they saw the peace, the temporary pause, as just a way to regroup and get more weapons so they could continue the fight. So in that particular context, the disaster really did have a psychological and a spiritual impact on people's ability to survive. So yes, in that case, it was very much something that I never thought to ask, but something that I found just from being on the ground and talking to people who are actually fighting and participating. In the case of Sri Lanka, I found the opposite in terms of the disaster and its impact on that conflict. I found that in that situation, with the already underlying socio and ethnic tensions going on, the disaster really negatively or leaned into the grievances of inequality, of injustice, the fact that one ethnic group was perceived as getting more aid post-disaster than the other ethnic group. Really, and it fed into the already underlying tensions that started the conflict. So in that particular case, it directly exacerbated the conflict and led to an escalation at that time.
Thank you so much, Professor Minott. Now I want to ask you, Ms. Tijen. Tijen. Where are adaptation and preparedness policies most aligned with current risk?
I think there are places, as I mentioned, I think in thinking about the communities that have experienced disasters and the lessons that they're learning in these places. So we see this across wildfire recovery here in the U.S. There are more attempts at kind of sharing lessons. So as we saw in the Camp Fire in California in 2018 and then the wildfires in Maui a few years later, we tend to see a lot of the same challenges cropping up in a lot of these emergency response systems. And I think particularly around wildfire now, we're seeing a lot more conversations about sharing lessons. So this desire for communities to avoid having to experience the crisis themselves in order to implement the policy reforms. So that's one area where I think in my own work, have seen more alignment between vulnerability and climate risk and policy responses. I also think we have examples internationally, and as Dr. Minott mentioned, I think one of the things that really strikes me in my research is, at least for my dissertation, my work is studying high-income federal democracies. And so the fact that the challenges for adaptation policy in these places is already so extreme is really concerning when thinking about other countries with much lower national budgets and much lower capacity to implement some of these things. So I think it's important to study in the places that have these higher budgets what some of the challenges are and have a better understanding of how we can address them in these places and apply those lessons elsewhere as well. But one of the other places that I have studied is Australia, and they, like the US, face quite similar climate hazards. So wildfire, sea level rise, they have a lot of coastline, and they also have a similar level of political polarization around climate change as we do here in the US. They have a strong fossil fuel lobby that has influenced public perception around climate change. And one of the things that we've seen in Australia in recent years is both the recommitment to climate adaptation and resilience at the federal level under recent governments, but also that in years there was over a decade of a conservative party in power at the federal level in Australia, but in some ways that party still did do climate resilience work. It was just labeled as something else. It was labeled more in terms of disaster response and resilience. And also during that period, there were a lot of policy innovations at the local and state level in Australia. So this idea of subnational innovation in periods where policy focus tends to dwindle at the national level. So that gave me a lot of hope, just thinking about the US and the moment that we're in right now politically, that a lot of the climate adaptation and resilience programs have been revoked at the national level. But I hope that as we're grappling with these policy shifts, that then subnationally we'll see more work on climate adaptation at the state level and at the local level, so that the work can continue and we can have more of that policy durability. And I do love the term of thinking about the sustainable public value as well. How do we make sure that this, the benefits of these programs, adaptation and resilience responses are really spread across society so that they can be sustained over time. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more of this and we'll see more kind of bipartisan cooperation on climate adaptation as well.
Thank you. Now that we have established what climate resilience is through each of you, so let's continue to understand how societies react to climate shocks through governance, equity, and delivery. And I mean, you mentioned a little bit about it, but we're gonna try to go more in depth and answer the question of who gets protected when systems are stressed.
And I think to begin this, we would like to ask, from each of you and your experiences, do you believe it's better to prioritize speed when doing these, when acting with resilience through fast rebuilding, or is it better to prioritize participation, which tends to be slower but can be more legitimate? And when do you think each of these backfire?
Let's start briefly with just thinking about in the recovery space, a lot of what's talked about is this idea of long-term recovery. So at what point is a disaster over, and when has the community recovered from a disaster? And this is a question that a lot of disaster managers and just communities in general, as they are dealing with the aftermath of a major disaster, the impacts often last for years. So in different countries, for example in Japan, the timeline for a post-disaster is considered more in years. So a community can still be considered recovering from a disaster for many years afterwards. And that allows them certain protections from the government and benefits. Whereas often in other places we see recovery as something that is looked at as short term. How can we quickly get a community back to a stable state? But I think personally that participation and really understanding the needs of a community before a disaster and after is much more important, and really incorporating this idea of longer term recovery timelines, because in reality a community can't just necessarily bounce back quickly. Obviously if we put a lot of preparation in advance, the hope is to bounce back quickly, but I also think that in terms of federal support and thinking about how we can give communities the resources that we need to have a much longer perception of what recovery is and how long it actually takes.
Thank you for your answer.
Okay, from my perspective, every crisis is different, and we have to be thoughtful about the idea that whenever you have a crisis, whether it's a minor crisis, whether it's a major crisis, you have to bring things to business as usual, right? So participation and speed are part of the solution for sure, but depending on the type of crisis, one or the other or both will have to be aligned depending on what the crisis might be. Because if is not the same, for example, if you have like an earthquake that ended up destroying like a huge city, like in Mexico City sometimes, than an earthquake in which the destruction was happening in an area in which the impact for the population themselves was tough, but not as bad as an earthquake that destroyed half of the city. So I guess it really depends on the size of that crisis. I guess that in regards to this crisis management, one of the most important things is to prepare and anticipate for whatever crisis, whether it has to do with climate, whether it has to do with other things, and the more prepared, the more you have been thoughtful about how you will have to react to a specific crisis, the better this alignment between the speed and participation will be.
Thank you very much for your answers. And something I am wondering. Oh yes, sorry, Professor Minott, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree with Santiago and Bethany in that how you respond to a crisis is very important, because people in the immediacy of it are in shock. So it's important to balance the long term versus the short term. How do you address the long term? You address the long term through planning and preparation. But when all is said and done, nobody expected a, Earth historical tsunami to impact a region. So there's only so much preparation you can do. So I think it matters in terms of the severity, whether or not, you have community participation, or whether, which is key, but in the immediacy of a disaster, you can't. You have to immediately address what's on the ground. What's on the ground in the case of something like a tsunami is you got to start collecting bodies. You got to start digging mass graves. You've got to start thinking about the immediacy. And then you've got to start thinking about fresh water. How do you give people access to water, to food, to a dry place to sleep? That is the immediacy of a disaster that has to be addressed. Nobody's thinking about community participation at that point, because everybody's in trauma, and everybody's in a mental space where they need help. So what is the most immediate forms of assistance you can give them? Now, once that phase parts, and it's a very short window of a phase that you have to deal with disasters in that respect, where somebody is coming in from above, taking control and helping and addressing the issue. Then, as things start to get settled, is where you start to talk about what are some of how can participation be incorporated in it. I've seen from the ground in Aceh, when after the disaster hit and the Red Cross, and actually the first point of contact was a U.S. military carrier that was going by, and they noticed, and they're the first ones to get on land and start to help. But after that, you start to see, once people are settled, once the fatigue gets in, you start to think about, okay, what next? And next is building shelters. Now, the rush to build shelters in that area and build permanent housing led to issues, because you come in as an international organization and you think one model fits all. And you try to adapt or build things for people, but then you're building it outside of their frame of the cultural context. So one of the things you start to see is they build these houses. In Aceh, most houses are built on stilts, but they built the houses too short, because the stilts in Aceh and the houses above mean that the space below is living space, where people can congregate and get out of the heat, etc. And the top space is sleeping space. So they go in and they build these houses that are really too short for that. So you eliminate that cultural context, people start to get frustrated and resentful. And that's where the participation comes in contexts like that. Once the immediate disasters and the immediate trauma has been addressed, then you start gaining participation from that.
Thank you very much for your answers. And something I'm wondering is, we keep saying that climate change is here and it's no longer something for the future. So I'm wondering, is prevention even possible at this point? Because there's already been so much damage done to people, plants, animals. So my question is prevention possible when we're so deep into the effects of climate change already?
I can get that. I'll be the first this time. I'm always in. In many cases, no. We're past prevention. That's a fact. There is a small window in some spaces, but right now, the way it's going and how our governments and the international community has been responding, in my opinion, there's no preventing it. We're going to have to focus on adaptation and building resiliency where we can, and staving off the severity of the impacts where they come.
Thank you.
I think I'll add just, it's about sort of mitigating like the future risk as well. I think that we are already on a track to have very extreme climate impacts, but that doesn't mean we should just give up on the idea of decarbonizing and preventing worsening future climate extremes. I think we have to be thinking about both at the same time. And yeah, I try to stay hopeful, because I think it's also challenging to work in this space if you fully just think that it's a lost cause. But I hope that we can kind of combine the types of responses to at least reduce the hazards and the future risk, not only for current generations but also future generations.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I think we're all on the same page on this. We have to be innovative. You know, there are solutions now that maybe 5 years ago were not available, right? Like now we have access to tools like artificial intelligence, and I can tell you, when I was a student, like many of you, a little bit more than 25 years ago, we were in these same classrooms, right? They all look like this. We did not have internet. We did not have smartphones, right? 2 or 3 years later, the internet showed up, and then it changed the whole environment and the whole way of finding solutions for many other things. I guess we are in a stage in which things are developing in different ways. We can use different tools that were not available a few years ago. Again, the world is dynamic. We need to be innovative, take advantage of these new tools that are evolving and that we can use to possibly change the preparedness documents or whatever we had worked on before that might be very different now because of the tools that we have at our disposal at this point. So I guess we have to keep a dynamic mindset and make sure that when things are evolving and changing, we have to go back and revisit what we did before, and there might be a few changes, there might be a lot of changes based on the tools that we have, and again, mitigating it's essential if we want to do this.
Thank you so much for your answers. And thank you very much to all of our panelists. Please join us for a round of applause. And now we would like to open up the floor for questions. Please, when you're asking a question, identify yourself, address a specific speaker, and also try to keep the question to less than a minute in terms. Thank you.
Hi there, and thank you for coming today. My name is Kate Berrigan. I'm a midshipman at the Naval Academy. I have a question for Professor Creuheras. Within the U.S., do you think that the topic of climate change is getting less attention? As someone, as part of a younger generation, sometimes I think as though its peak was maybe when activists like Greta Thunberg were very active on the internet. Is it realistically possible to really prioritize policy regarding climate and regarding climate change and adaptation and resilience when even you yourself said that today in 2026, a barrier and a common misconception is still the fact that it doesn't exist or it isn't important? And we talked about how, maybe there is no going back and we're already deep in the thick of climate change, but is the solution to keep going at the rate that we're going at and waiting for a crisis or a disaster to finally do something about it? Or how do we shift, the people's mindsets who are in power and actually, working on policy? Is there realistically any solution or do we just keep going at the rate that we're going at? Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question, and I think it's really important because we have the people and we have the government, right? So governments have priorities, people have priorities. We should expect that these priorities be aligned all of the time. That is not usually the case sometimes, and I can tell you from my professional experience, like 10 years ago, when we were really working on climate change and climate policy, countries like China, countries like Russia were really reluctant on having conversations in regards to this, and countries like the US, like Mexico, like Germany, like France were leading the discussion, right? And China didn't want to even sit on the table in regards to having conversations in regards to this. 10 years later, China is willing to lead the discussion, right? There are other countries in which in terms of the government, it seems to be that it's not a priority. On the other hand, it might be a priority for the people themselves, even though the government might be saying, we don't worry about this thing, this is not real, we have these documents or this evidence that does show that it's not important. Maybe the people believe that it's important, and we didn't bring in the conversation a lot in regards of the role of the people and the subnational governments. I can tell you this from the perspective of my country, Mexico, in which we had an administration, this past administration that ended like a year ago, through President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was completely reluctant about the importance of climate policy and clean energy and energy transitions, even though Mexico, it's a country that it's got like a lot of resources in both fossil fuels, in both renewables, and from that perspective, the subnational governments decided to develop their own climate policies. Depending on the sovereignty of each country, of each state, the subnational governments ended up developing this because for them it was important. Like I can tell you, one of the states in Mexico, Puebla, for example, is one of the few places in which they have geothermal energy. Right? That's not something that you can find, like, even if you wanted to have geothermal energy as one of the things that you wanted to work on as part of your energy policy in your country. There are countries that will not have geothermal energy. There are states in big countries like Mexico that only maybe out of 30 states, 2 or 3 of them may have geothermal energy. If that state doesn't take advantage of what they have as their own resources, they'll be stagnating, they'll be staying behind in regards to that. So what that state started doing is like, I'm not fighting with the federal government, but I have to move forward with my geothermal policy, otherwise I will not be competitive with the rest of the world in terms of geothermal energy. So I guess that it really depends, and again, the non-profit sector, the civil sector also has a stake on this, and that doesn't necessarily mean that what is happening within the government, what is happening within the priorities, will be the willing of the people or of the majority of the people. We have seen, and this is not just for the US, it is for many countries. Every administration has its own priorities, and in some cases it might be climate, in some cases it might be housing, in some cases it might be health, depending on what's politically feasible, depending on the situation, and if I might say, depending on what the majority might be willing to accept or not. Because in the end, if you have a democratic country, Congress can change things, the Supreme Court can change things. So the administrations do not necessarily will be aligned to their own policies, because you have other powers that might be changing the situation depending on what the people want.
I just want to add to that, thinking about the U.S., that I think, as we were talking about long-term recovery and short-term recovery, I think also in thinking about attention to climate change, there's sort of the more immediate, okay, what are the, like, there was a report that came out recently, I think it was maybe a McKinsey report on the landscape of risks, and it was a big survey of experts who sort of answered questions about what they think short-term versus long-term risks are. And short-term, I think, as we all know, we're all probably on social media, we read the news, there are so many competing crises that I feel like are pulling people's attention away, and I can understand why it feels like climate maybe had a moment of attention with activists like Greta Thunberg in previous years, and now it seems like maybe something that's not talked about as much. I think part of that is the challenge of we have these co-occurring crises geopolitically and just in very many different arenas where there's a lot of things to be concerned about. But in that report, there were all of these other things that came before climate in the short-term risks category. But in the next 10 years, across the board, most of the people surveyed said that climate change was the most important risk looking forward. So even thinking about a 10-year time horizon, that's not very long. But I think the hope is ideally for policy to be looking that far ahead and thinking about these future risks. But unfortunately, what we see instead more often is this more short-term prioritization of what is the current issue that people care about the most, the economy or healthcare. And so the challenge is aligning those policy cycles with the more long-term risk horizon of climate change.
And to tag on to that quickly, just read an article just a couple days ago, I brought it up in my classes. From a policy perspective, this administration has been 100% successful in their goals of dismantling all environmental protections from a national and international level across the board. Where you're going to see the fight and where we have hope is on the state level. It's on the local level. We see that even Massachusetts, they have a coalition with both red and blue states working together to maintain and strengthen environmental resiliency and policies, because the previous administration implemented policies across all states, particularly in red states, as it related to climate change and environmental strengthening and resiliency strengthening. So on the federal level, there is really nothing to be done at this point, but there is hope on the state and national level, and hopefully as time progresses, we'll be able to implement and reinstate some of the important issues on the federal.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Morning panelists, thank you for speaking with us. My hypothetical is for you, Ms. Tijan. It's the same 4 years after you get your doctorate, you end up working for the Green Party. They capture the presidency in a stroke of miracle. And you are the key policymaker on climate change, and they give you unlimited money to enact any policy. What two would you recommend to the president?
That's a great question. So I think, I'm gonna have to think about this for a second, if I have to just choose two policies. I think based on my work, the biggest thing that I feel like is super necessary is just incorporating the consideration of evolving climate risk into hazard mitigation policy. So we think about hazard mitigation, so thinking about flood resiliency, thinking about building codes and infrastructure improvements and things like that. One of the biggest, it seems really obvious, but it's just a really big challenge with the, like, for example, the National Flood Insurance Plan, which is a program that has a lot of challenges, but it came into play because because the flood insurance industry, the private insurers backed out of flooding as a hazard. And so then when we think about how do we design policies that actually improve resilience rather than reinforcing risk, I think that just one of the most basic things is that we need to incorporate the evolving nature of climate hazards into policies. So updating all of the policies that we have and designing new policies that go beyond just infrastructure-based resilience. I think we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure a lot of really great investments into infrastructure. But I think one of the things that I saw in my research is also that a lot of communities require more social support in preparation and action on climate resiliency, because a lot of the biggest challenges that they were experiencing were related to just general vulnerability. So as I talked about earlier, just the idea of a community that has better health care or better emergency management systems, that community will be able to bounce back after a disaster. So I think my two probably initial policy responses would be updating policies to include evolving future risk and incorporating more social vulnerability considerations into the policies then.
If you allow me to jump in, I would like to ask you just a few questions, right? Rather than you asking me the questions this time, or any of the panelists. Have you ever been to a polluted city? You have, right? Have you got headaches and coughing because of that? Yeah, right? Do you care about clean air? Right. Okay, so when you go to whatever place, do you like to open the tap and make sure that the water is water you can drink? Or do you always want to have water that it's like bottled water? What do you prefer? Tap, right? Whenever you go for a walk, right, near your parents' house, wherever you lived, if there's a river, if there's a forest, do you want that river, that lake to be clean or to be dirty and polluted and smelly? And what do you prefer? Right? If you walk through the forest, do you want the forest to be clean or do you want it to be like full of trash and smelly and with pests and everything? Okay, those are my questions. Thank you. I don't know if Professor Minott wants to jump in.
No, I'm good.
Are there any final questions you would like to make to our panelists?
Okay, so we've got two more. Okay, yeah.
Hey, how you doing? My name's Toby. I'm a current public health and Master's of Biomedical Science student, focusing mostly on implementation science. So this question is going to be focused on that. I would actually like to pose this to all three of you, if anyone has any comments on them. But I would like to talk about like what institutional and political and like narrative groundwork can we set in place so that, because as global attention changes based on what's going on in the world and the priorities at the time, how can we set up this groundwork to shift so that when we have a time in which climate change is an important topic, we can use this short-term focus to really create like concrete government action. And then a follow-up question to that is how can we use local governments? I know Dr. Minott, you talked a little bit about how we can use local governments, maybe community organizations and collaboration so that we have implementation-ready models so that when the time comes for more national windows, we can actually use models that we already have to create that good work and really have the momentum to use that short term or that short time. Thank you.
Okay, so as a teacher in this and being sort of in the arena where I am, I have the privilege of being around students who want to make change, who are heavily committed to moving forward, at least not necessarily in the sphere of a career in environment per se, but in many different areas of, we have business students, sustainable business majors, we have political science and international affairs majors at Northeastern who take my classes. And I think one of the things that teaching environment in today's climate is doing God's work in a lot of ways because there is very little good news out there. But one of the things that I always try to emphasize is that right now we are where we are, but things will change. The pendulum always shifts and moves in the universe. And so I always encourage my students to, not only just on an individual level, because I think that is good, but also is a shortfall in terms of how we frame and look at environmental policy and our role in policy, but also looking at it from a broader, more holistic level. So I've told my students, whatever career you choose, wherever you are, whether it's local government, whether it's in corporate, whether it's in nonprofit, you find ways of connecting these linkages, whether it's at the local and community government level, you create and start building all of these things that Bethany and Santiago have talked about, building resiliency, incorporating clean energy and clean energy efficiency and all of that in these models and on the ground, working with businesses locally. What can they do? How can they adapt to the changes? Because I think once we start moving into taking where we can't ignore climate change anymore, and we can't ignore that our fossil fuel energy structure is doing more harm than good, then you're going to have these small-scale initiatives and these small-scale successes and failures, because we learn from our failures as well. And then you have it at those levels, and you learn from it at those levels, and then you start to scale up, and you start to bring it up, because that's how policy works. It's, you work from it, you actualize it, you implement it, you see what works and what doesn't work, and then you build upon it.
Yes, I agree with that, and I'll just add, I think in my work I study federal systems, so multi-level systems like we have in the US, like Australia has. And there are particular challenges in these systems. For example, when managing climate change, sometimes it can be easier with a more top-down system to be able to just mandate action on climate change. But I think one of the benefits that we see in a time like right now in the United States of having a multi-level government system is exactly what Dr. Minott said, the ability for lower levels of government to continue action when one level is not able to. And so there's actually a term for this in federal systems called compensatory federalism, where other levels of government compensate for a lack of action at another level. And so we saw this in Australia when they had their long period of federal inaction on climate change. And we also, I think, hopefully will be seeing this increasingly now, and we've seen it in previous periods in the United States where states and local governments are really compensating for a lack of action at the federal level. So that makes me hopeful that there are examples of this in other parts of the world, of how multi-level government systems are able to sort of continue the work while a certain level is stalling or not acting.
Thank you for asking that question because it gives me the opportunity to just share a few words in regards to leadership. I think leadership is really important, and I am sure that I'm sitting in front of many future leaders, and you will all be leaders in different sectors. Some of you will be leaders in the military, in the Navy. Some of you might become leaders in the diplomatic arena. Some of you might be becoming business sector leaders. Some of you may be in the non-profit sector, right? So when we talk about leadership, we have to ask ourselves, what's our why, right? And what is our most important why? Leadership, according to Professor Heifetz, it's a function of authority, right? An authority can be formal and can be informal, right? So if we think about, again, an equation in which we have leadership as a function of informal and formal authority, throughout our lives we will have formal authority at some point. You know, I may become a general at some point. I may become the CEO of Apple or Microsoft. I may become the leader of Greenpeace if I'm the leader of a non-profit or whatever, right? So I will be balancing as part of my why, of my leadership, that formal and informal authority, right? What do you think is more important? I believe the informal authority, which is the one that doesn't end with that position that you have for a specific period of time, is the one that you have built on. And it has to relate with that why that you have in mind, right? So if you want to focus on transforming the world from a not clean world in terms of climate and the environment to a cleaner one, right? And that's your why. Then you have to work on that balance in terms of your formal and informal authority. But I can assure you, being maybe 30 years older than you, that informal authority is important because you can do it from different perspectives. In my time, at some point, I was leading an international organization with the endorsement of the US, with the endorsement of my country, with the endorsement of many of the G20 countries. And now I'm in academia, and I'm still talking about these things. I'm working on climate change. I'm working on energy efficiency, democratization, right? From the perspective of academia. At some point in time, I was doing it from the perspective of my government. At some point in time, I was working from the perspective of multilateralism, not just my government, other governments. I have been working with the Sustainable Development Banks as well, from the development perspective and the global financial sector. Now I'm doing it from academia. I think in the same way, you will be working on that with jobs that will be allowing you to lead throughout that why that you have decided for yourself, and you will have also informal opportunities for doing it. Just talking to your friends and telling them, make sure you turn off the light before you leave. We need more energy, right? We need to save energy. That's very informal, but people might know you and remember you from the rest of their time. Oh, my friend in college was always telling me, turn off the light before you leave.
Thank you. Maybe we could do one final question.
I actually had a question. So I was wondering, thinking more about like the economic perspective and the big companies and like their responsibility on this. I'm from a state in Brazil that suffered a lot from mining companies, and 2 disasters happened there in 2015, and then again with another big company in 2019, and they had like a lot of people displaced and also people that lost their lives. And I was wondering how the policies and how we like as local communities can like enforce this when it comes to like really big companies and those that are really hard to get, for instance, law enforcement, because they have so much money and they have so much land in those communities. But when it comes to people that actually lose everything, they're still in court right now and they didn't get financial support or anything. So I was wondering your thoughts on just like big, really big companies and how us as small individuals can be resilient to that. Thank you.
I can start quickly. I don't have a perfect answer to this question, but it made me think a little bit about the International Court of Justice advisory opinion that came out last year on climate change, and just that was like really the first time that the ICJ had made a statement on just basically, well, they laid out a legal opinion on climate change, an advisory opinion. And the hope is that this will then inform courts, domestic courts, as a precedent for how communities can actually have a little bit more standing when it comes to these kinds of cases, particularly when thinking about climate-related cases. But yeah, this is a very challenging topic in general because there are so many layers of injustice. And so when we talk about climate adaptation and resilience, there's all of these layers as well of thinking about corporate accountability and mining, and that goes beyond just climate change, but also environmental degradation, and thinking about also on the green transition and communities that are actually being very harmed in the mining of materials for solar power and things like that. And so the layers that we need to think about are really complicated, and it's not something that I personally work on, but I think it's something that a lot of people really are talking about right now, and thinking about how we make the green transition also equitable and are aware of the implications of it, because it's not a simple thing. And I think that many communities are experiencing those impacts right now beyond just climate vulnerability, but also vulnerability to mining and other environmental harms.
I'll jump in. Thank you for that question. And I guess from my perspective, it kind of relates to my previous comment in regards to creating sustainable public value. So these things don't happen again. And for that to happen, I guess you have 2 choices: either building institutions or destroying institutions that can actually protect that. And if we want to make sure that once we approach any of these failures in the system, when we try to solve these problems from an economic perspective, from a political perspective, from an environmental perspective, we need institutions that allow you to make these public value creation sustainable, because you will not be there all of the time, you know, even though it's part of your why, even though it's what you want to do, you may have the opportunity to be there for a period of time or not, but you have to create the institutions that allow you to make sure that these things don't happen again, and that also makes sure that the recovery, as you are mentioning, for the case of Brazil, which is very specific with the mining and everything, is protecting the people and the forest and all that have been damaged because there were no regulations, there were no institutions, or there might have been a lot of corruption involved in these things happening. And again, that's what is causing that the rivers are dirty, that you have a lot of pollution and a lot of other health problems in the area for sure.
Okay, thank you so much to our panelists for being here with us, sharing more about like their experience and also everything they share with us in terms of climate resilience. We would like to end this conversation with the following message. So far in this symposium, we have discussed food security, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, and much more. But when these serious topics of conversation are placed within the context of our planet, which is slowly but surely dying, they become secondary. Climate change is no longer a concern for the future, but a crisis we must act on now.
Thank you all very much for being here today with us, and please give a final round of applause for all of our panelists.